On 31st October 2000, the United Nations Security Council unanimously passed Resolution 1325, formally recognizing the Women, Peace and Security agenda, the impact of conflict on women, and the significant role women play in conflict prevention, resolution, and post-conflict reconstruction. Since then, 9 further resolutions have been adopted, addressing women's active and effective participation and the prevention of conflict-related sexual violence. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda, popularly abbreviated as WPS, is underlined by 4 pillars: participation, protection, prevention, relief, and recovery. Today, 32 African countries have adopted national action plans to implement WPS. Welcome to Season 4 of the She Stands for Peace podcast, a series by the United Nations Office to the African Union, supported by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Now, regular listeners of the podcast will know that past seasons have been a series of interviews with key actors working to achieve WPS in Africa. In this 4th season, we depart from this format. Instead, each episode unpacks various topics aligned with the 4 pillars of WPS, with insights from guests playing critical roles in achieving the agenda. In the last episode, we discussed women's participation in negotiating peace agreements, ensuring agreements are inclusive, and the importance of an inclusive approach to implementation and monitoring. In this episode, we turn our attention to young women peacebuilders. Fostering intergenerational dialogue and co-leadership on silencing the guns in Africa is crucial to promoting good governance, peace, security, and development. Silencing the Guns is a flagship project under the African Union's Agenda 2063 and is recognized as a key accelerator of Africa's economic growth and development. In previous episodes of this podcast, we have interviewed several young women involved in peacebuilding. In 2018, the African Union created 2 critical programs to engage youth in peacebuilding. That is the AU's Youth for Peace program and the Office of the Youth Envoy. Both implement Article 17 of the AU Youth Charter and the UNSCR 2250 and 2419. Chido Impemba became the AU's 2nd Youth Envoy in 2021, taking over from Aya Shebi, whom we have spoken to in episode 12 of this podcast. The Office of the AU's Youth Envoy plays a critical role in championing youth development in Africa and fostering inclusive participation.
The program was essentially set up to engage meaningfully with young people and promote their participation in the peace and security arena.
That's Dr. Rhuks, coordinator of the African Union's Youth for Peace Africa program. The program aims to engage young people and youth groups in promoting peace and security on the continent. Fundamentally, the priorities of the program were set by young people.
The program from start recognized that there were young people out there doing what they do on a daily basis, and that they do those things with the knowledge, some with varying degrees of experience, but certainly all of them were resilient in keeping on the work they were doing in their communities, despite the different challenges they faced, from institutional challenges, financial challenges, having to mix, their dedication to peace and security with uni, work, family, whatever it was. So there was that strong sense of resilience in them. And I say this because severally you find in reference to young people, it's always as if we are trying to help them. No, we're trying to recognize their efforts to help the African Union leverage, derive from their comparative advantage in the sector. So this is what the program did. So, I just had to front load that. We found young people in their various spaces doing amazing work, and 2 things came out of that. One was getting the buy-in of the Peace and Security Council, the AUPSC, to recognize the contributions and the roles that they play in peace and security. And thankfully, that engagement precipitated what we now know as the YPS, Youth Peace and Security Agenda on the continent, which, without boasting, I would argue is one of the most advanced on the continent. So to answer your question, it would be to say The role of the program was to recognize these young people, empower them, contribute to the work they do, enhance their output, and B, to leverage on their experience, their expertise, their knowledge to feed into the broader peace and security agenda of the Union. And I think those two objectives so far have been met adequately. So in a sense, how do we leverage the WPS on the YPS agenda in a sense, right? And I think to start off with that would be to say that the one thing about the YPS agenda is youth is transitory. And so you can take the YPS arena, if you like, as a breeding ground for the WPS agenda, all right? Because the skills, the knowledge, the experience they get as young people, within that certainly comes to play later on in life. Two things I would like to highlight. One is that young women have been playing critical roles in the peace and security agenda on the continent. And I think if we take a statistics of the number of young women that are out there doing their thing, it's obvious. But I'll give you two examples with the Office of the Youth Envoy at the African Union and also the Africa Youth Ambassadors for Peace, which the program coordinated and managed. The two youth envoys at the African Union level have been women, young women. So it shows that they had something that qualified them for that position. And that position has also then enhanced whatever it was they had to put them in that policy space to be able to advance not just issues of youth generally, but to bring that recognition that young women on the continent are recognized for what they do. And we can confidently put them out as the ambassador of young people, broadly speaking, on the continent. Now, with the IAPS, we've had 3 cohorts, with the most recent starting about a week ago or so. If you do a statistics of the 3 cohorts, you'll find out that a majority have been women. So for this cohort, 3 of 5 are women. The previous cohort, 3 of 5 were women. So that also tells us something, that where you have a process where it's blind, and I can speak for an hour on the process of how to select IAPS, you would see that it's a really rigorous and blind process until the final stage. So what that tells us also is that the YPS agenda not only recognizes young women, but that young women are indeed doing things that on a blind scale is portraying them as actors in their communities. And we do not shy away from recognizing them and putting them at the forefront when we recognize, going through the due diligence that they are indeed the right ones to be there. Sometimes it's like, no, it's peace and security, perhaps a man will be better. But no.
A 2021 UN report on call to action stated young women's participation in leadership and formal politics is important because they are, and I quote, powerful advocates for intergenerational collaboration and are leading change on issues like climate change, racial justice, and gender equality. So whilst we are seeing examples of young women in political leadership in countries like Namibia, where Emma Inamutila Theophilus, born in 1996, is the country's Deputy Minister of Information, Communication and Technology, and Bogolo Kenewendo, born in 1987, who was the former Minister for Investment, Trade and Industry, these are still relatively absent across the continent. Meaningful participation and inclusion of young women in leadership and politics has occupied the advocacy of our next guest, Hannah Lema, founder and director of Addis Powerhouse in Ethiopia.
So Addis Powerhouse is a young women-led feminist knowledge production platform that conducts gender research and evidence-based advocacy in Ethiopia. I founded Addis Powerhouse to mainly facilitate access to knowledge for young people and to use this to advocate for the inclusion of young women in decision-making. Because in my context, girls and young women's issues are neglected and they're rarely given that attention that they deserve. So if you see cases of online gender-based violence, catcalling, and other forms of sexual harassment that particularly target young women, they are usually neglected and no one gives them a second thought either, especially decision makers. This is mainly attributing to the youth's lack of access to information and to tools for self-advocacy. So that's why we chose to focus on these objectives at Addis Powerhouse. And in the past year, we've been expanding our projects to the regions by producing knowledge about the national dialogue and other peace-building efforts in the country and advocating for the representation of young women in national consensus building. We have conducted multiple participatory researches and advocated for the inclusion of politically active young women from say like different ethnic, religious, and political backgrounds in peace building efforts. And something that we've learned on the job and something that usually comes back to us is that when people think of their group youth, they usually think of young men. And whenever we're talking about women, we're talking about a group that has agency and can self-advocate, that is established group. So in both instances, we're leaving young women in our intervention, from our discussions, due to this very noticeable biases. And it's the same bias that we usually set out to tackle at Addis Powerhouse. And we're usually demanding for young women to be included at all decision-making tables because they have different, like completely different asks from young men and established women, particularly in the context of peace building and politics. So when it comes to our approaches, we use participatory action research, like I mentioned, and we employ feminist lens in the work that we do. So, for example, for one of our projects called Nurturing Young Women's Agency for Peace, we were able to document their interests on the ongoing national dialogue. And the goal was to ultimately ensure that the representatives of young women in the agenda setting process of the national dialogue will be able to speak on behalf of other young women who face multitude of hardships post-conflict. And at the very end of the project, we were able to create a network for politically active women across different regions. So they can work together and demand for their rights from a united front despite having different political ideologies. And we're usually promoting for solidarity and for young women to come together and pose their questions to decision makers together, because that really gives them power. And I think it's very important to really understand why young women are not coming to decision-making positions in general. And if you allow me, I would like to reflect a bit on the problems that we have that are, preventing young women from coming to decision making. And I do believe that it starts from home and in our society, because we raise young girls to be good wives while young boys are raised to be leaders in our cultures. And there are all sorts of negative stereotypes that are attached to being a woman leader, a politician. And so from a very young age, we're preventing young women from dreaming of power, of leadership. This also means they have less opportunities in schools and in their careers to network, to develop their knowledge and skills, and to generally apply themselves in leadership and politics. So I also think that beyond this socialization and the lack of access that I've just mentioned, when it comes to skill and knowledge development spaces, there is an evident gap in the system and the policies that are built to improve women's political participation and leadership. And if you look particularly in the case of Ethiopia, there is no quota system for political participation that's built into our policies. So although 50% of the cabinet in 2018 was women, there had been 50-50 representation. And this was considered to be very progressive. It wasn't maintained because it wasn't institutionalized at the moment. And even once after they come into politics, women are attacked more harshly than their male counterparts. So at Addis Powerhouse, we recently interviewed a former minister, and the comments we were receiving on social media, they showed us that, to be a female leader and a politician is basically to receive a shorter end of the stick because they were attacking her personally. And we often see that with women in politics. They're asked more personal and inappropriate things in interviews compared to their male counterparts. And the public generally demands more from them, to an extent where they're expected to perform, stereotypically feminine and caregiving roles in leadership. And we also see very evident data that shows that women in politics get sexually assaulted quite often, and they have no place to go to and report because they're being targeted by powerful men. And at other times, they're not even given the proper respect, or their contribution goes unacknowledged because in general, there is this imbalance and they have little to no incentive to stay in leadership positions. And even worse is that young women who look up to these women are losing role models because there is no incentive to becoming a women leader in the current context, especially with the conflict and instability. Women are sidelined even further. So if you see in cases of Ethiopia, Sudan, and many other contexts in Africa where there is conflict, women are the first to get sidelined. So when you consider all of this, it's a very detrimental issue, but there are always three recommendations that I have in mind when I think of this. And there are actions that we're usually recommending to the stakeholders that we work with at Addis Powerhouse. And one of this is basically creating an enabling political environment. Like I've mentioned before, we need to be able to establish quotas. We need better implementation of affirmative action and a system in general where women are not sexually assaulted. They're not relegated to stereotypically caretaking roles in leadership, where there is peace and stability. So overall actions that just improve intentional leadership can definitely improve women's experiences in leadership. And it goes a long way as to empowering young women to claim decision-making roles as well. The second action that we usually recommending is knowledge, capacity, and resource development for young women, because if you can develop young women's capacity through trainings and skills, establishing mentorship circles, networks, coalitions to aid their leadership journey, to facilitate knowledge for them. All of these things we're already doing at Addis Powerhouse with the ultimate goal of ensuring that these young girls can self-advocate, because we don't want to keep advocating for young women. Young women need to be able to take on the stick and also run for themselves. So that's what we're usually recommending as an action step. And the third and final one is what I mentioned as a problem first, which is the society. We need to be able to, challenge the gender norms, the societal expectations on women. We need to be able to create awareness in the society that women can lead and they're actually proven better leaders and peace builders, and showing that, things as simple as unpaid care work should not be relegated to women alone, because that is basically stealing time and energy and space from women and what they can be from them as well. So it's something that's simple, but something that we need to give attention to in order to make sure that young women still aspire to come to decision-making spaces, to leadership, to politics.
So far, we have approached the theme for this episode by highlighting the role of young women in peace building and how they are already participating. But equally important is understanding how conflict and the lack of representation of young women in peace building impacts the lives of girls and young women. Many reports highlight these reasons. For example, the UN Secretary General's annual report on conflict-related sexual violence highlights how young women and girls are affected. A UNFPA 2022 report on the impact of conflict on women and girls globally highlights a range of impacts, including the impact of peacekeeping operations. Less discussed, though, is the gendered experiences of young female fighters who, according to a 2008 research by Coulter, Person and Utters, are often, in quote, denied access to official DDR processes because the international community does not recognize them as real fighters, end quote. We spoke with two female ex-combatants from the Central African Republic, Aboro Olga and Modenoko Andriane, and we have used a translator to share their insights.
One of their barriers is about assuming that that lady is married. Most of the time, their first barrier is their husband. They don't allow them to have access to DGR programs. Obviously, their husbands are combatants. And whilst staying in the bush, they cannot allow their women to have access to DGR programs. Secondly, the barrier is about stigmatization in the society, because when they would like to have access to DGR programs, sometimes they could be subject to mockery and stigmatization. The fact of being afraid, because after DDR process, in case of any situation, they cannot defend themselves. So there's a problem of security and safety here. To add on this, educating a woman or a woman is a fact of educating a whole nation. So a woman is an advisor, the one giving peaceful advice to her children, her husband, and the whole society. So blocking them or denying them access to DDR program is not good because they have to be trained, they have to benefit from all what others are benefiting. So far as this peace agreement is concerned, for what we understand and we know, it's a very good process. And right now, it's going on. We are feeling that change. The security situation has changed. Although there are some part of group which withdrew themselves from these political peace agreements. But what we can do as female ex-combatants is to keep on sensitizing those who are still holding guns with them and sharing experience with them, trying to advise them so that this peace could be restored definitely. To add on what we just said, we have to continue sensitizing, doing some concrete actions to encourage those who are still holding weapons with them to drop it and adhere to DDR process. And the government as well has to, with his partner, should do their best to encourage those who are still in the bush to adhere to DDR. Because, as an example, I can get access to DDR today, and tomorrow I go in the bush for farming or hunting or fishing. I can meet those who are still keeping the weapons with them. So they think that I've betrayed them, and whatever I have with me, documents, whatever they're gonna destroy it, burn it, or if they have some nylons, they can burn on it. So it's that the situation. Right now, nowadays, we don't have enough female combatants. So most of them have already dropped guns there in the town. The most challenge is about psychological trauma. So we are wishing that some partners like MINUSCA and other NGO specialized in the domain could come closer to those young ex-combatants to try to work with them, help them, and train them. Because the most problem is a psychological trauma. To help us getting out of these situations is just through psychological support, counseling group, and other training, and some exchange, the fact of being together, sharing ideas. It's like that. We can help them.
That's it for this episode of She Stands for Peace. Next time, we turn our attention to the protection pillar and hear the stories of threats and challenges faced by women, human rights defenders and peace builders. How do we protect them? Until then, stand for peace with Africa's Women, Peace and Security agenda.